Hi and welcome to School Shorts with me, Melissa Chan Green, journalist and mum of two with an interest in education and especially all the things that help our children to read, write and spell. And in this episode we are speaking with Natalie Wexler, the author of The Knowledge Gap. Knowledge being a crucial word there, because if you've ever had an experience where you've been reading with a child and they have actually decoded and read all of the words in the book but got to the end and struggled to understand or communicate what actually happened in the book, this should be really useful. It's got some practical advice around building comprehension and fluency. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Melissa. I'm delighted to be here.
Lovely to have you here in New Zealand, and excellent that you're able to speak with teachers here too, because teachers as well as parents are on a journey as to what the science of reading is, because this is a kind of new term really here in New Zealand. A lot of people think it's phonics, but is it just phonics? I know much of your research is saying it is much more than that.
Yes, and not just my research. There's a lot of scientific evidence related to reading beyond just what is related to phonics. And I do want to emphasize that it is important to teach all children phonics systematically, because most of them will probably not become proficient readers if you don't teach phonics. But I mean, phonics is kind of necessary but not sufficient to enable kids to read the kind of text they'll be expected to read in later years as they go up the grade levels. And what's equally important is being, as you said, able to understand the text. And so there's a lot of science related to reading comprehension. And unfortunately, the way we've been trying to teach reading comprehension also has conflicted with a lot of the evidence about how comprehension actually works.
Right. Okay. So we've spoken in some other episodes a little about what phonics is, which is kind of decoding or breaking down sounds and words and then building that into sentences. But you're saying that if we are teaching just that and we're not looking at how we actually help children understand the words, then you're actually not fully teaching according to the science of reading.
Right. And what is crucial to helping kids understand the words is to build their knowledge and vocabulary, their knowledge of the wider world and their more sophisticated vocabulary than they're likely to pick up just through conversation. Because all text assumes certain knowledge. I mean, writers don't explain every word they use. And especially as the text becomes more complex, there are more assumptions about what the reader already knows. And the assumptions tend to relate to more academic kinds of knowledge and more sophisticated vocabulary. So it's really important, while we are teaching kids the basics of decoding and enabling them to become fluent readers, that we are also building their knowledge of the world, especially in the early years through read-alouds and discussion. So kids' listening comprehension exceeds their own reading comprehension before they become proficient readers, on average through about age 13. So the reading aloud to them from texts that are more complex than they can read themselves and having dialogues with them about the content of those texts is really crucial to get that more sophisticated knowledge into their long-term memory. And then when their decoding skills improve, the knowledge they have stored in long-term memory will kick in to enable them to read and understand texts on a range of topics.
That makes sense, because if I'm thinking about if anyone has ever learnt another language, you can hear people speak that language and you kind of understand a lot more about what they're saying than you would be able to read or write on a page when you're learning, right? And I guess this is where parents can really come in and play a role in terms of assisting with that background knowledge. So I want to get to that shortly. But what I wanted to ask, Natalie, is that a lot of people who say that phonics or the science of reading is missing this crucial part of understanding, are you saying that actually it doesn't, but we actually just have to have a better understanding of what science of reading is?
I think we have to have a broader definition of the term science of reading, because, as I said, there's a lot of evidence beyond that relating to the need to teach phonics systematically. In the United States, we have tried to teach comprehension through teaching comprehension skills and strategies. Things like finding the main idea of a text or making inferences. And those skills are important, but they can't really be taught in the abstract. So and maybe here too, we've had kids just practice making inferences on books that they can read independently. But something like making inferences is not a transferable skill, like decoding words or like riding a bicycle, for example. If you know how to ride a bicycle, it doesn't really matter what bicycle you're riding, you'll be able to ride the bicycle. But whether you can apply a skill like making an inference depends to a large extent on how much relevant background knowledge you have. Mm-hmm. It's much easier to make an inference if it's a text that's on a topic you know a lot about. You're going to do it automatically, really. Mm. If it's a text on a topic that you don't know anything about, it's maybe impossible to make the necessary inferences. So we've got to put the content in the foreground rather than trying to teach these skills in the abstract, and kids practicing them, on a bunch of random topics just doesn't work because it's not that kind of skill.
So I guess that's something that you can start building right from birth almost, it's certainly something that begins before school, like traditional school, right?
Yes, and I think what happens really the criterion here is level of parental education. So parents with higher levels of education, I don't think they deliberately try to expose their children to knowledge of the world and more sophisticated vocabulary, but it happens just naturally. Mm. But parents with less formal education, they're not using the same kind of sophisticated vocabulary. They may not be having quite the same kinds of discussions about history or whatever. And so what happens is kids often enter school with different levels of background knowledge. And schools can do a lot more than they're currently doing to level that playing field. But often what happens is the longer kids stay in school, actually, the wider that gap grows between the kids who start with more knowledge and the kids who start with less knowledge.
And this is the equity gap, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
What do you think schools can do to close that from, kindergarten or year one?
Well, I think the most important thing, not the only thing, but the most important thing is to adopt a curriculum that both covers foundational reading skills like phonics and builds children's knowledge and vocabulary by immersing them in topics and literature, children's literature, but also topics in history and science. Mm-hmm. Those topics have, it seems, the most potential to build the kind of knowledge and vocabulary that fuels reading comprehension. And so in the United States, we have a growing trend now towards adopting these kinds of knowledge-building early literacy curricula. So they cover different bodies of knowledge in different ways, but they will all be organized by topic rather than skill of the week. This week we're working on making inferences or visualizing or whatever. And they'll spend at least 2 or 3 weeks and sometimes much more on a topic because kids need to hear the same vocabulary concepts repeatedly over a period of time for those things to really stick in long-term memory. Secondly, a good curriculum will give all children in the classroom, regardless of their individual decoding ability, access to complex text in some way, and that could well be through read-alouds and discussion. And third, they will connect the various aspects of literacy, and we might get into this more when we talk about writing, but so the 4 basic aspects of literacy are listening, speaking, reading, and writing. And before kids are proficient readers, the most efficient way to build their knowledge of a new topic is through reading aloud, and then having them discuss what they've just heard, use the vocabulary they've just heard, helps transfer that new information to long-term memory. Mm-hmm. And once they have knowledge and vocabulary relating to a topic stored in long-term memory, they are likely to be able to read about that topic at a higher level because the information will already be familiar. And so they don't have to juggle new information at the same time they're dealing with the demands of reading. And then lastly, writing about it, that is the hardest aspect of literacy, so that comes last, but it's really crucial as well.
So could this be what we're seeing potentially in New Zealand classrooms as something that's often called inquiry? So, for example, my son at the moment, he's year 1, and they're talking, they've been speaking over quite a number of weeks about freezing and melting, and they've been doing experiments about, how to melt ice and how things freeze. And so would it be kind of looking at that topic, reading text to the children around that topic, and that is going to help their kind of background knowledge in terms of those words when they come up? Is that the kind of example?
Yes, absolutely. And, depending on the grade level, you might have available to children some books on the topic that they've been learning about through oral language, through listening and speaking. And if their decoding abilities are, good enough, then they'll likely be able to read at a higher level than you might expect about a topic that they've already learned about through listening and discussion. So yes, that's a good example.
And then, so as parents, is it something you could think about at home, say, reading nonfiction texts about different topics that your children are interested in, and I guess not focusing so much on, making sure that in addition to helping them decode in the books that they might bring home, you're actually still just reading to them texts about other subjects.
Yes, it's really important for them to get exposure to texts that are at a level of complexity that's higher than what they can read themselves. And it's not just the vocabulary and the concepts, but also the syntax, the sentence structure. The syntax of written language is almost always more complex than the kind of sentence structure we use in conversation. And so the other thing that reading aloud does is it can help familiarize kids with that more complex syntax of written language, which is almost like a second language, even if you're a native English speaker.
So is this why two children could read the same text and have a different understanding? It's basically because of their level of background knowledge on a topic.
I'd say the level of background knowledge is a prime factor, but there could also be lack of familiarity with that complex syntax and vocabulary. I mean, there's a famous experiment that we talk about a lot in the United States called the baseball study, where they took a bunch of kids who were maybe 12, 13 years old, and they divided them into 4 groups depending on how much they knew about baseball and how well they had scored on a standardized reading comprehension test. And then they gave them all a passage to read describing part of a baseball game and tested their comprehension of that passage. And the poor readers, according to the test, who were baseball experts, did very well when they were reading about baseball. In fact, they did better than the good readers who didn't know very much about baseball. So background knowledge is hugely important. But I sometimes say, well, if that had been sort of a PhD dissertation about baseball, probably even the baseball experts who were poor readers would have struggled with that because of the sentence structure and maybe the more academic vocabulary that would have been used. So background knowledge is important, but again, it's not enough because reading comprehension is really complicated.
Yeah, it does. There are so many factors that feed into it, right? Which is important, I guess, that's what educators are being trained in themselves, and not just looking at one part of the science of reading, because if you, say, miss the background knowledge part or you miss the syntax, then you're not actually fully helping those young readers.
That's right, yes. And in the early grades, it can be deceptive. It can look like kids are proficient readers. But then when they get to higher grade levels and there are more assumptions about what they already know and the syntax and the vocabulary become more complex, then they can hit a wall. So we have to be thinking when kids are in, the early grades, not just what kind of vocabulary and sentence structure do they need to read what they can read on their own now. We need to be thinking, what are they going to be expected to know 10 years from now, and start planting the seeds of their success later on.
Right, through building the knowledge around those topics.
Yes.
Is this fluency? Are we talking about fluency here, or is that something else?
Fluency is, I'm not an expert in fluency, but it is kind of a hybrid between decoding. It's sometimes called the bridge to comprehension. it's hard to read a text fluently if you don't understand it, but it's also hard to understand a text if you can't read it fluently. So fluency is hugely important, and I think that is often the obstacle at higher grade levels. I mean, kids can decode, but they may be expending so much effort on decoding the words that they don't have the cognitive capacity for comprehension. So it is important to have kids practice reading the same passage maybe several times in order to develop fluency, and also listen to a fluent reader and then mimic that. Fluency really means reading it's not just reading fast. Sometimes people think it's just being able to read fast, but it's reading at an appropriate pace with appropriate expression, which of course, it's hard to provide that appropriate expression if you don't understand the text. So it's fluency is kind of complicated, but it is really crucial.
I hear lots of adults reading texts in ways where sometimes the emphasis is on the wrong words, and so actually fluency is something that I guess is evolving over your whole life sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's true.
In writing is something that really, you mentioned earlier, as something that can really cement comprehension and help with that reading skill too?
Yes. I sometimes worry that with all of this emphasis on reading, this has certainly been true in the United States, that we're overlooking writing. And first of all, writing is harder than reading. And we don't spend at least in the United States, we don't spend much time trying to teach kids how to do it. We kind of expect them to just pick it up. And many of them don't. So it does need to be taught explicitly. But it's not just a vital skill. Even in the age of ChatGPT, it is important.
I was going to say, because that's, a lot of people say, we even need to know how to write.
Well, here's why we do need to know how to write. Because beyond being a vital skill, it is potentially an incredibly powerful way of reinforcing and deepening knowledge and understanding and the ability to retain information. This might be a little complicated, but there's this concept called working memory, which is the aspect of our consciousness where we are taking in new information and trying to make sense of it. And it's very limited. It can only maybe hold 4 or 5 items of new information for about 20 seconds before it starts to become overwhelmed.
Is that for everybody?
No, that's on average. People's working memory varies, but there isn't any reliable way to expand any individual's working memory. But there is a way around it, which is having lots of stuff stored in long-term memory, right? So if you have relevant information stored in long-term memory, you don't have to juggle that as new information in working memory. So that's why if you have prior information about a topic, your capacity to understand the text is going to be greater. If you already know a baseball term like double play and you're reading about baseball, you don't have to go look it up. You don't have to think about that. You can just attend to the new information.
So the goal is to have as much in long-term memory as possible. Then you can take on more things in your short working memory.
Absolutely. And here's where writing comes in. So there are a couple of tricks to getting information in and out of long-term memory. So to transfer new information to long-term memory, one thing that really helps is to explain it to someone else in your own words. And then you also have to be able to retrieve it from long-term memory when you need it. And so retrieval practice is what helps. So the more you practice retrieving an item of information, the more likely you are to be able to get it in the future. And there are different ways to do that, quizzes. But again, one really good way to do that is to explain the information to someone else in your own words. And that's what we do when we write. We are explaining information to someone else in our own words. So it helps with both transfer of information and retrieval practice. And in addition, it helps with something cognitive scientists call elaboration, which just means asking and answering questions like how and why, questions that require you to elaborate. And that deepens not just retention of information, but also comprehension. So these are all things that we do when we write, if we're writing well. So it's very powerful in really reinforcing and deepening knowledge. But the problem is it's also really hard, as I mentioned. So if you're struggling with just the task of writing, you don't have the capacity to get those cognitive benefits. So to unlock the potential of writing, we need to make it manageable for kids. And that means teaching it explicitly and beginning at the sentence level. And that also helps with familiarizing children with that complex sentence structure of written language. If you can use something like a subordinating conjunction in your own writing, you're going to be in a much better position to understand it when you come across it in your reading. So writing is, this, if we subcontract out writing to a chat bot, we are going to be missing out. Children are going to definitely be missing out on a lot of learning opportunities. There are now some studies showing that you really risk if you offload that mental effort. Yeah, it's going to be easier, but you are not going to understand what you've theoretically written about. You're not going to retain that information if you haven't expended that effort.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I hear from people talking about AI who are working in this area, is that you can access information. You can, the information is at your fingertips. But again, I guess that's where it means we all have to learn how to learn. We have to learn how do you take that knowledge and commit it to long-term memory? Or how do you really fully understand it or know it if you've just kind of typed it in and looked it up?
Right.
It doesn't mean you know it. It doesn't mean you've learned it.
Absolutely. And that's what the studies are showing. So, for example, there's been some studies with writing, but one study was with math students who had used ChatGPT to help them study, and they thought they knew this stuff, but actually on the exam, the group that had studied in the old-fashioned way did better. Now, this is not to say there aren't good uses of AI in education, and you could use it actually to quiz you could use it for retrieval practice, and there are studies showing then it can be quite helpful. But I think we have to be very careful because the temptation is, to just rely on it because it's so much easier. So we have to really be careful about placing guardrails on the use of it.
What then we've spoken a bit about background knowledge and writing. For a parent, what are ways in which you can best assist at home with those things? We've talked about reading texts, more complex texts than your child might be able to understand. Are there any other bits of advice?
I mean, it depends on the child, I mean, sometimes they're not really interested in doing writing activities at home, but I have talked to parents who've used, so I'm the co-author of a book called The Writing Revolution, and it's really a guide to teaching writing in any subject, any grade level, although with younger children, you want to do it mostly orally. But I would say, first of all, you have the luxury as a parent of following your child's individual interests, which, if you've got a class of 25, 30 kids, teachers can't really do that. So if your child has developed an interest in, say, rocks or whatever, then yes, get books out from the library about rocks, go and supplement it with conversations about rocks and going out and looking at different rocks. And, just all of that oral language is also important. But then you might also, if you want to try to build some of those writing skills and use writing as a lever for learning, you could do something like, and this is one of the sentence level activities that's in part of the writing revolution. You could have a sentence stem that a child has to finish with each of the three conjunctions: because, but, and so. Like, rocks are interesting because, rocks are interesting but, rocks are interesting so. And that is both reinforcing their knowledge that, they have to retrieve the information, put it in their own words, elaborate on it. And it's also familiarizing them with the use of those conjunctions. And then you could move on to, although rocks are interesting. And that's a more complex construction that they're not likely to be using in conversation.
So because, but, and so are a good place to start. And then, if you're using a topic that they're interested in, they're going to be more likely to engage with you.
Yeah.
And I guess you're kind of then setting them up for work that they might be doing in the classroom. And that's not a bad thing if they've already had a practice, they've already kind of retrieved that information.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't worry about, getting ahead of what's going on in the classroom. I think if it can only be helpful to enrich whatever they're learning. And I think it's also important for parents to know what their children are learning about in the classroom and supplement that. If children are interested in a topic that they're learning about in school, you can go deeper And I think that's a great thing to do.
A big question for you here, Natalie, because in the States, as you said, there's been a movement towards science of reading, as there is here. You know, we've got a new curriculum here. What is the one thing that worries you about how we are moving in this direction in terms of what is the thing that we really need to focus on to get it right?
I think the thing that worries me the most is that the science of reading is often being reduced to just more phonics. And as I said, phonics is really important, but it's not enough. And also, you know, I think with the best of intentions, some schools in the United States are spending an hour on phonics every day. And I don't think any expert would advise that. I mean, it's 20 to 30 minutes is what I've heard is advisable. If you do too much of it, it can kids might get tired of that. And also, what has happened in the past, we've had this pendulum swing, phonics, no phonics. And when the pendulum has swung in the direction of yes, phonics, when kids get to higher grade levels, they can sometimes decode the more complex text, but not understand it because of a lack of background knowledge. But in the past, when that's happened, people who are skeptical of phonics have said, well, you see, they can decode that text, but they can't understand it. Therefore, phonics doesn't work. But it doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means it's not enough. And I worry that not only are we're risking not equipping kids to do well at higher grade levels, but we're also risking having the pendulum swing back away from phonics.
Right.
If people say, well, you see, they don't understand it, so it doesn't work.
Right. So it's not an either or. It's kind of saying, yes, phonics, but we have to supplement it with all of this other learning as well.
Yes, and that is where a good curriculum can be very helpful because it can, apportion the time in ways that make sense. So we're going to spend 20 minutes on phonics, and then we're going to have a read aloud on this topic that, we've been learning about and a discussion about that. And that's very engaging for kids as well. I mean, I've been in classrooms and talked to lots of teachers, and sometimes people think of building knowledge as something, it's like going to be drudgery. But, young children are very curious about the world. And if you present them with almost any topic in an engaging way, they get fascinated and they want to learn more about it. And they want to read about it on their own as well. I've heard that over and over again.
And I imagine actually for a teacher, that's quite an exciting part of the job is building the background knowledge around particular topics.
I've talked to many teachers who've switched from this skills-focused approach to comprehension to a knowledge-building approach, and it's, I think, become a much more rewarding job for them. They see, first of all, their kids are excited and engaged, but they can see the wheels turning. They can see kids actually learning something. More than one teacher has said to me that before you just did not see those light bulbs going off, and now you do.
Tell me about the knowledge gap. You've spoken about the writing revolution, the knowledge gap. Who would benefit from reading that?
Well, it was written with a general audience in mind. Mostly in the United States, educators have been reading it, but some parents as well, definitely. And it's really, when I started writing this, I was actually not very well versed in it's a very complex subject. So I really had to figure it out for myself. And it was pretty hard work. But I think maybe that's an advantage because for people who aren't familiar with this, I'm explaining it in ways that they would understand because I was in that position myself.
I think there's a lot of people who would like that.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating and important topic, really. Education has the potential, I think, really to be an engine of social mobility and just, a source of pleasure for kids if we can get this right and understand the role of knowledge and also that knowledge building can be fun.
Yeah. Are we on the right track?
I hope so. It sounds to me like New Zealand is ahead of the United States, certainly in terms of the government's support for this kind of thing. And we have a much more decentralized system in the United States. So there are a few states that are doing more than others. I would say even the states that have been doing a good job with the phonics side of the science of reading, there's only maybe 2 or 3 that are recognizing, we also really need to pay attention to building knowledge. And it sounds to me like the New Zealand government understands the importance of doing both.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Natalie Wexler. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here in New Zealand, and thank you for making time to come and speak with us on School Shorts.
Well, thank you, Melissa. The pleasure was all mine.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. If that topic was helpful for you and you'd like to hear more, please do like and subscribe. It sends me that feedback. School Shorts is all about supporting busy parents who want their children to thrive. Follow on social at School Shorts NZ for fun ideas, helpful resources, and exclusive giveaways.